गिरिवरदारी गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरदारी यशोदनंदन व्रजजन रंजन यशोदनंदन व्रजजन रंजन यशोदनंदन व्रजजन रंजन यमुना तीरा वनचारी यमुना तीरा वनचारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरदारी जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरदारी यशोदनंदन व्रजजन रंजन यशोदनंदन व्रजजन रंजन यमुना तीरा वनचारी यमुना तीरा वनचारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी जय राधा माधव कुंज बिहारी हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा श्रील प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा श्रील प्रभुपदा Jim Vishtabad Brahmam Chapal Lecture to Sadasi Simon Vedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki jai. ISKCON Seshadripuram Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Jim Vishtabad Brahmam Chapal Lecture to Sadasi Simon Pakistan Sarsil Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada ki jai. Jim Vishtabad Srila Gauri Krishnadas Bharti Maharaj ki jai. Jim Vishtabad Satsyananda Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura ki jai. Jim Vishtabad Vaishnav Swami Sri Jagannath Das Bharti Maharaj ki jai. जय श्री रूप सनातन भट्ट रघुनाथ श्री जीव गोपाल भट्टदास अविनाश गोस्वामी प्रभु की जय। आचार्य श्री हरदास ठाकुर की जय। प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद की जय। श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण गोपिकांत श्याम कुंड राधा कुंड गिरिगोवर्धन की जय। श्री श्री गौरांगी बंगलोरेश्वर भगवान की जय। श्री मायापुर धाम की जय। श्रीमदान धाम की जय। अंगमयी की जय। यमुनामयी की जय। भक्ति देवी की जय। तुलसी देवी की जय। अनंत कोटि वैष्णव की जय। श्री हरिनाम संकीर्तन की जय। ग्रंथराज श्रीमद् भागवतम की जय। ISKCON वर्तमान गुरुवंत के समावेद भक्तिवंत के गौर प्रेमानंदे all glories to the assembly. All glories to the assembly. All glories to the assembly. All glories to the Guru Shri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswati Vyasam Tato Jayamudishaye. Ishtaprayeshu Abhadreshu Nityam Bhagavati Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Sloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishti. Hare Krishna. Welcome to the Friday morning Srimad Bhagavatam class. Today we are reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 28, Text 35. Mukta Shrayam Yarhi Nirvishayam Viraktam Nirvanam Vichyati Manaha Sahasayatachihi Atmanamatra Purusho Vyavadanam Ekam Anvikshate Prati Nivritta Guna Pravaha Muktasriyam Yarhi Nirvishayam Viraktam Nirvanam Vichyati Manaha Sahasa Yatachihi Atmanam Atra Purusho Vyavadanam Ekam Anvikshate Prati Nivritta Guna Pravaha Muktasrayam Yarhi Nirvishayam Viraktam Nirvanam Vrichyati Manaha Sahasayatachihi Atmanamatra Purusho Vyavadanam Ekam Anvikshate Prati Nivritta Guna Pravaha. Translation about part teacher. When the mind is thus completely freed from all material contamination and detached from material objectives, it is just like the flame of a lamp. At that time, the mind is actually dovetailed with that of the Supreme Lord and is experienced as one with Him because it is freed from the interactive flow of the material qualities. In the material world, the activities of the mind are acceptance and rejection. As long as the mind is in material consciousness, it must be forcibly trained to accept meditation on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But when one is actually elevated to loving the Supreme Lord, the mind is automatically absorbed in the thought of the Lord. In such a position, a yogi has no other thought than to serve the Lord. This dovetailing of the mind with the desires of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is called nirvana, or making the mind one with the Supreme Lord. The best example of nirvana is cited in Bhagavad Gita. In the beginning, the mind of Arjuna deviated from Krishna's. Krishna wanted Arjuna to fight, but Arjuna did not want to. So there was disagreement. But after hearing Bhagavad Gita from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Arjuna dovetailed his mind with Krishna's desire. This is called oneness. This oneness, however, did not cause Arjuna and Krishna to lose their individualities. The Mayavadi philosophers cannot understand this. They think that oneness necessitates the loss of individuality. Actually, however, we find in Bhagavad Gita that individuality is not lost. When the mind is completely purified in love of Godhead, the mind becomes the mind of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The mind at that time does not act separately, nor does it act without inspiration to fulfill the desire of the Lord. The individual liberated soul has no other activity. Pratinibritta guna pravaha. In the conditioned state, the mind is always engaged in activity impelled by the three modes of the material world. But in the transcendental state, the material modes cannot disturb the mind of the devotee. The devotee has no other concern than to satisfy the desires of the Lord. That is the highest stage of perfection, called nirvana or nirvana mukti. At this stage, the mind becomes completely free from material desire. Archihi. Archihi means flame. When a lamp is broken or the oil is finished, we see that the flame of the lamp goes out. But according to scientific understanding, the flame is not extinguished, it is conserved. This is conservation of energy. Similarly, when the mind stops functioning on the material platform, it is conserved in the activities of the Supreme Lord. The Mayavadi philosophers' conception of cessation of the functions of the mind is explained here. Cessation of the mental functions means cessation of activities conducted under the influence of the three modes of material nature. Om Jnanmirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Ena Bhutale Swayam Rupadamaham Tadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sankrajatam Sagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sijivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Pada Sagana Rita Shri Vishakandidamscha Ye Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Kupesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishabhanishte Devi Padmami Hari Priyam Anchakalpatarubhyasya Kvasindubhya Vacha Patitanam Bhavnebhya Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advait Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So here we see in this verse, Lord Kapila is mentioning how to free the mind completely from material contamination and detach oneself from material objectives. So Srila Prabhupada also mentions in the purport, mind has got two activities. One is acceptance and rejectance. Acceptance means mind dictates that I want this or I desire this. So the mind dictates that please do this. And we take a decision, even if it is against our willingness, we take a decision to do it. This is called sankalpa. And the other thing is vikalpa, whereby the mind rejects what it thinks that it is not required. So even if it is required, sometimes we might feel that I don't require it. The mind dictates that. So that is why in Bhagavad Gita, the Lord explains very nicely as to how the senses, the hierarchy is made, in the sense that the senses are about the dull matter, and above the senses is the mind, above mind is the intelligence, and above intelligence is the soul. So one must properly use his intelligence to understand whether the mind is dictating correctly or incorrectly. So, but when one dovetails his mind in the activities of the Lord, then automatically what happens is the mind is engaged in the service of the Lord. And when one's mind is engaged in the service of the Lord, then what happens is that whatever comes within from the mind is 100% perfect, because here, as it is mentioned, that mind becomes one with the Lord. What does the Lord desire? Lord's desire is that the living entity should serve him, because being the part and parcel of the Lord desires that living entity serve him. So when that desire is achieved, that is the oneness that is mentioned here, which is called nirvana in this particular sloka. So example is given as to how initially Arjuna was reluctant to fight, but after he heard the instructions from Bhagavad Gita, he was prepared to fight. He fought and he became successful in the battlefield. So these are examples that are given to us as to how one should place his mind in the service of the Lord. And when one controls his mind by using the mind in the service of the Lord, automatically one starts becoming detached from all material contamination, and that is that oneness. Generally, but what happens is that many times, here an example is given about the Mayavadi philosophers, how they understand. When they say they become one with the Lord, they say that they become Lord. I mean, they have themselves become God by saying that oneness. But that oneness does not mean that one becomes God. The individuality always remains. The individual living entity was always there. The individual living entity is there, and the living entity will continue to be as individuals in the future also. That individuality is also mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita. And the Supreme Personality of Godhead's position is also mentioned in Bhagavad Gita as a supreme controller. And the living entities being the part and parcels have to be controlled by the Supreme Lord, who is the controller, by rendering service unto the Lord, thereby dovetailing everything in the service of the Lord, whether it is the senses or the mind or the intelligence. But when one is engaged, and when one is engaged completely in the service of the Lord, then that is what is called perfection of all the limbs of the body, for example, mind or intelligence, etc. That is what is called that oneness. Not that when one renders service, he becomes Lord. One can never become Lord. It is due to this wrong understanding that one becomes God, that the Mayavadis think, and so they are also, it is said that these impersonalists or Mayavadis, they always fall down. They don't stand in that position because they don't want to serve, but they want to become one with God, which can never happen. So ultimately, somehow or the other, the conditions, the mind has to be engaged in the service of the Lord instead of being engaged in the activities of the material nature, which is consists of the three modes of the material nature, that is goodness, passion, and ignorance. So all the activities in this material world are conducted only within the three modes. That is why it is called a conditioned state of mind. But one starts to serve the Lord, and when the mind is engaged in the service of the Lord, automatically the mind becomes free from this material desire. It does not have a desire to serve the material nature. But unfortunately, the mind is so uncontrollable. Arjuna himself says in Bhagavad Gita, Chanchalahi Mana Krishna. But still the Lord says that one should try to practice with determination. That means one must practice and one must have determination to do that. These are two very important points, because at some point of time, the living entities tend to lose the practice. And sometime point of time, they also tend to lose that determination, which is mentioned here. But one who tries to do things on his own whims and fancies are compared like Ravana and Kapsa and etc. Now, the Bhagavad Gita itself, the Lord says that he who discards scriptural injunctions and acts according to his own whims attains neither perfection nor happiness or the supreme destination. That means one who acts according to his own whims and fancies, he cannot, whatever he does is actually does not lead him to perfection, nor does it give him happiness, nor does it take him to the supreme destination. So it is said that those who act based on these whims and fancies, they are all called Ravanas. This is what Ravana did, because he did what he wanted and what he liked. And the same was the case in the case of Hiranyakashipu also. So that is why it is said that those who try to think that they are being dictated by the mind, they are all called Ravanas and Hiranyakashipus. There is one example, live example, a few years back in one of the cities. There was a killer. He was a serial killer, in the sense he would find people who are sleeping in the streets, and he would kill them. Sir, clear murder case, and he used to do this very continuously. And finally, when he was caught, he said it was his inner voice which inspired him to kill so many human beings. Now, this is what happens. Of course, he was given a very severe punishment. If you see in today's material world, there are so many crimes that are taking place against all types of living entities, not only human beings, even all the animals. So many of them are mistreated, and they are killed for one's sense gratification. So people think that it is as a dictated by the mind itself, but it is because they are ignorant of what is given in the scriptures. That's what is mentioned here. One who discards the scriptures, he does not attain perfection, nor yet does he have happiness On the other hand, he falls down from his original place. In fact, even Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when he was here, he used to beg all his students. He says, Krishna is your father, Krishna is your mother, Krishna is your life and wealth. I fall at your feet and beg you to engage your minds in thinking of Krishna. So even when Krishna was here in the Bhagavad Gita, also he says, Manmana Bhakto Madhyadi Mam Namaskuru. So one should somehow or the other should engage the mind in the service of Krishna, even if it is not against one's liking. This is what I mentioned, and acceptance and rejectance. Today, many people don't want to serve the Lord. This is, even if it is required, this is what I call rejection. Because the mind says, what is the point of serving God? This is that rejection. But in spite of it, one should try to accept, even if the mind says no, because that is a constitutional position. And that is what scripture says. When the scripture says that mind should be situated on the proper platform, by serving the Lord, then automatically one's desire for other material activities diminish, and that becomes one with the Lord. For example, when we start serving, when we do that, we start with Shravanam Kirtanam, we start losing the taste in other things like TV serials or cinemas and things like that. That is the time one should realize, yes, now I'm developing a distaste for all material activities. I must now gradually, of course, it is not, surrender does not take place overnight, but it's a step-by-step process. Because the reason is that mind is very, very difficult to control. It is said that mind is like an unchaste woman, because even if it is left idle for a very short moment of time, a few seconds, then it can take anyone to ruination. That means if the mind is left idle, they say, my idle mind is a devil's workshop, which is true. Some of these proverbs maybe are really true, because if the mind is left idle for a single moment of time, and when one thinks that, what should I do? At that time, the mind will go on to so many things. And then at that, if you have some object which can satisfy the senses, immediately the mind goes on to that particular object. For example, if one has got a TV, then one thinks that, oh, there must be something in the TV now which I can watch. Even if the mind says that it is not correct, but still the few moments are there, one might think, okay, let me put my few moments in seeing what is there in the TV. So any object that is there, that is available readily on hand, are instrumental for diverting the senses away from Krishna and always engaging the acts of the modes of material nature. One might think that, okay, there are serials coming on God itself in the TVs. I can watch that also. But many of them are not even authentic. Like, for example, one particular theory that is, example that is given is about how the Mayavadis think that we are all one with the Lord. We can never become one with the Lord. But the real oneness is fulfilling the Lord's desires, or diverting our desires in a way that the Lord's desires are fulfilled. What is the Lord's desire? Lord's desire is that we should serve the Lord. If that is there, then that desire is perfect. But otherwise, if that desire is not in line with the desire of the Lord, that is imperfection. So that is why it is said that mind should never be left idle. Another example that is given is about a monkey. A monkey's habit is it keeps jumping from one branch of a tree to another branch. So similarly, this mind is like a monkey which takes jumping from one thought to the other, past, present, and future. One moment, one person is happy, and the other moment you see the person is in a dull state, sorrow state. But actually, this body is a dull matter. Mind is also a dull matter. And the senses are also dull matter, and even the intelligence is a dull matter, and so also our false ego. So all these are existing and covering the soul, which has got the real consciousness. If the soul leaves the body, mind, the senses become dull. The mind and intelligence take the soul to the next body. So ultimately, it is the mind which takes us to another body by the activities that one has conducted in one's particular life. There was an article some time back as to how there was a sadhu. So he was asking a person who came to him, asking a question, how to control the mind. So the sadhu said that, what is it that you like the most? So the person said that, I like chocolate. So the sadhu said, you give up this chocolate. The person replied that, I can't give up chocolate because it's what I like. So the sadhu replied that you can't give up something that you are able to see for yourself. How can you give up something which you are not able to see, which is the mind? So the mind, we cannot see the mind, but we can always realize as to how the mind dictates. Why? Because the Lord himself says that mind is very restless, it is turbulent, it is very obstinate and very strong. And to control the mind, it is difficult than even controlling the wind. But this Lord also says that it is undoubtedly very difficult to curb the restless mind, but it is possible by suitable practice and by detachment. So one must practice what is called devotional service with under proper guidance, who has got a reference to the scriptures, who delivers whatever is possible from the scriptures in a proper bona fide manner. Krishna also tells Arjuna that one should deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself, because the mind is a friend of the conditioned soul and is enemy as well. He also says, for one who has conquered the mind is the best of the friends. But for one who has failed to do so, his mind will be the greatest of the enemy. But when one is engaged, when one engages his mind in the transcendental loving service of the Lord, then one reaches a state of pure existence. And that is that oneness with the Lord. Because the Lord is transcendental above the three modes of material nature. So when the mind is also engaged in devotional service to that Supreme Lord, it becomes as clear or clean as pure water. And that is the liberated stage in this, even in this material world. There are many wrong thoughts that one gathers in one's life, wrong thoughts, wrong impressions, and all these are carried by the activities that one has conducted in his previous life. So that is why we might see sometimes when a child is born, at that time itself, the child may be very, very notorious or very, very mischievous. On the other hand, we might see some children, right from their birth, they are directed, or they feel some pleasure in doing, in hearing some kirtan, playing mridanga. So many things are there. So that is why it is said that the mind is like a sharp knife. When it is in the hands of a cook or a soldier, it is a friend, because a cook or a soldier uses it in the right perspective. But a butcher uses it for the wrong activities. So that is why it is like a knife in the hands of a butcher. After all, knife is also a material object. It is neither good or bad. So knife is also a small material object, but the utility is different. The knife in the hands of a soldier is positive, and a knife in the hands of a butcher is utilized for the wrong activities. So this way, the mind takes one to activities which one has done in his previous lifetimes. And these things gather up as a lineup of impressions in one's mind. And when the soul leaves the body, the mind and intelligence covers the soul and then takes it to the next body based on one's deserve and one's desire. One may desire to become a millionaire, but then if one's activities are not compatible with it, one can be born as a very poor person also. So it has two things. One is a desire, and the other one is a desire. So mind is always directing for many things. And even before one's desire is fulfilled, there is a line of flow of desires that are always flowing through one's mind. So it is very difficult to control this flow of desires. One wants to fulfill all these desires, which are never possible. But what happens is that when one engages the mind in the service of Krishna, that is why he says, Manmana bhava madbhakto madhyaji mam namaskuru, mame vaishyashi satyam, yuktevam atmanam matparayana. He says, engage your mind always in thinking of me. Become my devotee. Offer obeisances to me and worship me. Being completely absorbed in me, surely you will come to me. So that means that Krishna says that always think of him by serving him, by becoming a devotee, by offer obeisances to him and also worshipping him. That's why it is said, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Sparanam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Satyam, Atmanigodhanam. So one should always engage his senses somehow or other, the service of Krishna. And for one whose mind is not controlled, self-realization is very, very difficult. Srila Prabhupada always mentioned that trying to engage the mind in material enjoyment and trying to practice self-realization is trying to ignite a fire and at the same time pouring water in it. That means if we try to engage mind in the activities of the Lord, at the same time thinking that I will try to enjoy my senses in the material activities, it is like trying to ignite a fire and at the same time pour water on it. The sixth canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, there are some very nice quotes. It says, above the five senses of perception, the five working senses, and the five objects of the senses is the mind, which is the 16th element. Above the mind is the 17th element, the soul, the living himself, entity himself, who in cooperation with other 16 enjoy the material world. The living being enjoys three kinds of situations, namely happy, distressful, and mixed. That means the living entity tries to enjoy three types of situations. One is happiness, one is distress, and one is mixed. Because happiness is also never fully mixed with happiness. There is always something. The moment one feels happy, immediately after some time, there is a situation that comes and brings one to distress. And then the following sloka, it says that this subtle body is endowed with 16 parts, that is 5 knowledge acquiring senses, 5 working senses, 5 objects of sense gratification, the mind. The living entity is composed of insurmountably strong desires, and therefore it causes the living entity to transmigrate from one body to another in human life, animal life, and life as a demigod. So one can get the life of a demigod, one can get the life of a human life, and one can get a body of a animal life also. When one gets that body of a demigod, he feels certainly jubilant. And when he gets the body of a human body, he is always in lamentation. And when one gets the body of an animal, he is always afraid. But in all the conditions, it is mentioned here, however, that is actually he is miserable. That means irrespective of whether one gets the body of a demigod or a human being or an animal body, any material body in this material world is always miserable. And this miserable condition is something which is what is, however, even under this miserable condition, when one thinks that he is happy, that is what is called an illusion. So in the same chapter, there's mention as to how the soul, the mind is the cause of all the tribulations in this material world. That means whatever suffering that one goes through in this material world is due to the mind. And as long as this is unknown to the conditioned living entity, he has to accept this miserable condition of the material body and wander within the universe in different positions. And because the mind is affected by disease, lamentation, illusion, attachment, greed, and enmity, it creates bondage and a false sense of intimacy within this material body. We'll go through each of these points because they're very important. This mind is always affected by disease and lamentation. Always, we have a disease in the material body somehow or the other, or otherwise we always have lamentation. We have a hankering for many things. Sometimes we might get something, we might possess, and when we lose, we have lament. Many times we also lament because we are not able to get something that we desire. That also is a cause of lamentation. So this is one. And then illusion. We always try to look at everything in this material world to be perfect, but world can never be perfect and correct. So that itself is an illusion which the mind carries us to. Also, there is a tendency for us to develop attachment to something or other in this material world. It need not be necessarily to one's kith and kin, but one can develop attachment to so many things that are there. Many times one develops attachment to maintain one's body. Now, for example, maintaining a healthy body is necessary, but at the same time, becoming attached to maintaining a healthy body is an attachment. So these types of attachments are there in this material world. Then greed and enmity. Now, many times, now it is also quoted in the Shastras, if our lust, we have lusty desires. When lust is satisfied, then one becomes envious or greed develops. And if lust is not satisfied, then anger comes. And when anger comes, when one's intelligence gets lost, and he falls again into this material world. So whether lust is satisfied or not, automatically all the time there's a disturbance. Either way, if it is satisfied, then we have multiple desires which continue to increase. And sometimes we develop envy and greed also. And in the process, many times it leads us to inimical situations. Sometimes even the closest to the person will become an enemy at some point of time because of envy that one develops. So these are all factors that create bondage for one in this material world. And they develop a false sense of intimacy within this material world. That is why it is said in the subsequent sloka that uncontrolled mind is the greatest enemy of the living entity. But if one neglects it or gives it a chance, it will become more and more powerful, will become victorious. That means if we given a chance for the mind to leave it uncontrolled, the mind will become more and more powerful and become victorious. And further, it is said that although it is not fractured, it is very, very strong. It covers the constitutional position of the soul. That means the mind, when it is left uncontrolled, it becomes very, very strong. And in process, it becomes, it covers the real constitutional position of the soul. Therefore, it is said that try to conquer the mind by the weapon of service to the lotus feet of the spiritual master and the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And it is to be done with a lot of care. That means one can conquer the mind by rendering service to the spiritual master and also to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but to be done with care. That means with care means under guidance from Sadhu Shastra and Guru. There is one more nice instruction that in which Jadabharata tells King Raghuna, because the mind is absorbed in desires for pious and impious activities, it is naturally subjected to the transformation of lust and anger. That means there is a desire within us to perform pious or impious activities. That is why the mind is subjected to transformation of lust and anger. That is why Krishna himself says that somehow one must become freed from lust and anger. These are the three gates to hell: lust, greed, and anger. So in this way, what happens is one becomes attracted to material sense enjoyment. That means the mind is conducted by the three modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance. So one should see somehow that the mind is free from the three modes of material nature by engaging it in the service of the Lord. Even though the mind might dictate, many times we might want to go to the temple to have darshan of the Lord or to hear some Krishna Katha from sitting speaker. But the mind might dictate, no, 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 I have something else to do. Why not I do that? And we become victim of the dictates of such mind. But one must have that determination. What is higher for me? What is better for me? And it is the mind that brings about various different types of birth in various species of life. But when the mind is situated on a transcendental platform, it automatically loses interest on the lower taste in life. So there is a quote in the 4th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam where there is a nice prayer. When a living entity is born to engage in devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the Supreme Controller, his birth, all his fruitive activities, his lifespan, his mind, his words are all actually perfect. That means a living entity is born to engage himself only in the service of the Lord. And when one engages himself in the service of the Lord, then his birth is perfect. All his activities are perfect. His lifespan is perfect. His mind is perfect. And all his words are also perfect. That means when one engages his mind in the service of the Lord, his words also become perfect. Many times Srila Prabhupada has also quoted that when one's chants his rounds properly and observes the regulative principles uh, on a regular basis, then whatever he says becomes perfect, which is true. That means when one is factually engaged in service of the Lord, at that time the mind is also in one with the Lord, that is with the desires of the Lord only. So when the desires of the Lord are satisfied, all his activities become fully perfect. There is one more point that is mentioned here in the last paragraph, that when a lamp is broken or oil is finished, we see that the flame of the lamp also goes out. But according to scientific understanding, the flame is not extinguished. It is conserved. This is conservation of energy. So many times we see that if the oil is finished, that the lamp goes out. But actually, as soon as you put the oil again, light the lamp, immediately the lamp is lit. That means here it is mentioned that though the flame is extinguished, the energy is conserved in some form or the other. So the energy does not go. It is said that the energy is not created, rather energy is conserved and maintained in some or other form. So similarly, when the mind is stops functioning on the material platform, it is conserved in the activities of the Supreme Lord. That means when the mind is engaged in spiritual activities, automatically it takes itself away from all the activities the material platform. That is why this example is given. But they also mentioned that the Mayavada philosophers of conception of cessation of the mind, what Mayavadis think, cessation of the mental function means cessation of activities conducted under the influence of. That means the Mayavada's philosophers' conception of cessation of the functions of the mind is explained here. Cessation of the mental function means cessation of creation, means cessation of activities conducted under the influence of the three modes of material nature. That means one should not conduct activities on the material nature, three modes of material nature, which if not done can lead one to mental functions, lead to material activities. So the example of the lamp is given that as long as one engages in the service of the Lord, one's activities from the material platform will cease to exist. So this is what I have, the sloka for the day. Before I conclude the class for the day, I thought there's one important, this thing today is also the day when Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu took sannyas, and in the process, Mahaprabhu was none other than the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But he took sannyas, and today is that auspicious day. And he began to search for his brother Vishwarupa. He said his brother Vishwarupa, when his marriage was being arranged, he left his home, and thereafter he did not return back. So Mahaprabhu went in search for him, and finally he came to this place called Pandharpur. And Mahaprabhu realized that he left his body there in that Pandharpur. And his name, Vishwarupa's name was Shankararanya. He was the elder brother of Mahaprabhu. And his pastime took place. Vishwarupa was actually the elder brother of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, actually. His brother left his body, he disappeared in Pandharpur. He was an expansion of the Sankarsana. And Srila Prabhupada quotes that because Mahasankarshana is the ingredient and efficient cause of cosmic, he is present in every detail. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu therefore called him his elder brother. The two brothers are known as Krishna and Balarama in the spiritual world, but at the present moment they are Chaitanya and Nitya. Therefore, the conclusion is that Nityananda Prabhu is the original Sankarshana or Baladeva. So, also, this is the day when our founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada took sannyasa from Kesho Bharati. So these are two important occasions that happen on this day. The history is that how Srila Prabhupada struggled in his life. And at some point in time, whatever businesses he took up also failed. And it said that Srila Prabhupada had multiple dreams of his spiritual master asking him to take sannyas. At one point of time, as Abhicharan, he realized that all his businesses had failed. So maybe his spiritual master is instructing him to take sannyas and then go to the Western world, preach in English and preach the message of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So that is why at one point of time, when again Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur appeared in his dream, Abhay realized that now he should take sannyas. So he went to one godbrother who was insistent that he should stay in the mutt, and somehow Srila Prabhupada wanted to go outside after taking sannyas, because generally those days taking sannyas, people were respected, sannyasis were respected. So then Prabhupada actually approached his godbrother Keshav Maharaj, and he agreed to give sannyasi. He gave the sannyasi to Srila Prabhupada and the sannyasi danda. Thereafter, Srila Prabhupada left to preach the glories of the Lord in the Western world in English language as directed by his spiritual master. So these are two important occasions that occurred on this particular day. So with this, I conclude the class for the day. I have some other activities now lined up. So if you have got any questions, one or two questions, I can take in the next 1 or 2 minutes. Anybody? Any questions?
Prabhu, Srila Prabhupada took sannyas diksha from Keshav Maharaj. Is that what you said?
Not Keshav Bharati, it's called Keshav Maharaj. Once again.
Keshav Maharaj.
Keshav Maharaj.
So that's his godbrother.
Yes, he was godbrother.
Okay. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu took it from Ishwarpuri.
Ishwarpuri, yes.
Yeah. And that's at Katwa.
Katwa, yes.
And it's the same day. It coincides with Srila Prabhupada as well as Mahaprabhu's. This one coincides.
Yes, Prabhu. Yes, Prabhu.
On the same day.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Prabhu.
Thanks, Prabhu. Thanks, Prabhu. Anybody else? Any other questions? Can I leave, Prabhu, because I have some other activity lined up?
Yes, Prabhu, by all means. Thank you so much, Prabhu.
Thanks, Prabhu. Thanks.
Harish.
Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada
Jai.
ki jai.
Jai. Hari Paul.
sir.